Osama bin Laden was born on March 10, 1957, in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. His father was Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, born in Yemen in 1908. As a child, his family emigrated from Yemen to the Red Coast of Western Arabia. This region now constitutes part of Saudi Arabia, but was then contested between the Ottoman Empire and the Royal House of Saud. In the 1930s, he became a prominent construction contractor for the first ruler of Saudi Arabia, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud. With the support of the royal family, the company he established, the Saudi bin Laden Group, became an immensely prosperous and wealthy construction firm in the nascent nation, even as it grew into the world's largest oil exporter and a remarkably affluent nation for successful families like the bin Ladens. Osama's mother was Hamida al-Attas, a native Syrian from a family known for their successful citrus farming around the port city of Latakia. She became Muhammad's 10th wife in 1956 at the age of just 14, marrying the 48-year-old millionaire. A year later, Osama was born. He was their only child, and shortly after, Muhammad and Hamida separated. Osama's childhood and upbringing were characterized by privilege. By the time of his birth, his father was a multimillionaire, although his wealth would easily amount to billions when adjusted for today's inflation. Shortly after his parents' divorce, Osama's mother remarried a business associate of Mohammed bin Laden named Mohammed al-Attas. They had 4 children together in the 1960s, 3 boys and 1 girl. Osama was sent to live with them and thus grew up in his mother's and stepfather's household, alongside several step-siblings. However, it would be inaccurate to say he was distanced from his father. Mohammed bin Laden had a significant influence on his son's upbringing, imparting much of his conservative religious enthusiasm. Starting in 1968, Osama attended the Al-Thagr Model School, a secondary school in Jeddah. In 1971, he experienced the Western world directly when he was sent to Oxford University in Britain. By the 1960s, the Saudi bin Laden Group had become one of the most important corporations in the entire Arab world. Its connections to the Saudi royal family were pervasive, and the company had been awarded contracts to oversee the ongoing repairs of the mosques in the 2 holiest cities in the Islamic world, Mecca and Medina. In 1964, the company obtained the contract to reclad the exterior of the Dome of the Rock, the most significant Muslim religious site in Jerusalem. By that time, the connections between Mohammed bin Laden and the Saudi royal family had grown extremely extensive. However, in 1967, Mohammed was killed at the age of 59 in an airplane accident in Saudi Arabia when the pilot miscalculated the plane's landing. Despite this setback, the Saudi bin Laden Group continued to thrive under the leadership of several of Mohammed's sons from his previous marriages. And indeed, as it expanded in the 1970s and 1980s, it evolved into a multi-billion-dollar corporation with profitable contracts throughout the Middle East. Osama was not engaged in the Saudi bin Laden Group's business activities in the years following his father's death, for the straightforward reason that he was too young. Instead, he was pursuing his education. At 19 years of age in 1976, Osama enrolled at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, where he started studying economics and business administration, certainly to assume some kind of role within the family business in the future. Already, however, he had begun to deviate from an interest in business, with accounts from individuals who knew bin Laden there, indicating that his main interests lay in religion, poetry, and Arab literature. He certainly didn't need to be concerned about finances, his education, and future employment, as Osama stood to inherit more than $30 million from his father's estate. At this point, he was also married, having married his first wife, a Syrian woman named Najwa Ghanem, in 1974, when he was merely 17 years old. She was also his first cousin on his mother's side, and the first of at least 5 wives. Osama would father over 24 children throughout his life. Clearly, the mid to late 1970s were a crucial period in Osama's life and his ideological perspectives, though much of the information regarding these years is frustratingly incomplete and at times contradictory. Nevertheless, the general direction of his views is evident. Osama started to cultivate a Pan-Islamist ideology from an early age in his life, a movement that advocates the notion that Muslims in all countries should come together in defense and advancement of their faith. This belief looks back to the era of the Arab Caliphate, which, between the 8th and 11th centuries, governed most of the Middle East, North Africa, and neighboring regions from the Caliphate's capital in Baghdad. Central to Pan-Islamism in the 1960s and 1970s was a commitment to diminishing and, if feasible, terminating Western involvement in the Middle East, a region that had been under the control of the British and French since the fall of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War, and where the United States was becoming an increasingly involved party even as the British and French influence waned. The Middle Eastern environment that Osama was raised in was also one where the newly established State of Israel, strongly supported by the United States, was often engaged in conflict with its Muslim neighbors, particularly seen in the Six-Day War of 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973. In the 1970s, a particularly profound influence on Osama came from the writings of Sayyid Qutb, an Egyptian Islamic scholar and theorist in religion and politics who had been affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood until his arrest and execution in 1966. Qutb's considerable writings were broadly disseminated in schools and universities throughout the Muslim world, starting from the 1940s, and encompassed claims that Islamic jihad, or the struggle against evil, was completely justifiable for the establishment of a new Islamic caliphate, and that Sharia law, the law derived from a strict interpretation of the Quran, should be enforced across all Muslim nations. A current of anti-Western sentiment also permeated much of Qutb's works, as he condemned the United States as materialistic, devoid of God, and lacking any form of spiritual values. If there was one key influence on bin Laden's ideological views during the 1960s and 1970s, it was indeed Qutb. Osama completed his education at Abdulaziz in 1979. It remains uncertain whether he graduated with a degree or not. This timing was significant, as the Islamic world was experiencing unrest at this time. Firstly, the Iranian Revolution of 1978 resulted in the ousting of the Western-supported Shah in Iran and the establishment of a new Islamic state led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Concurrently, to the northeast in Afghanistan, the nation was spiraling into political turmoil. In 1978, the Marxist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA, had taken control and started to create a socialist, secular state. The PDPA had enduring connections with the Soviet Union, and indeed Russia had always held an interest in Afghanistan since the mid-19th century, when the country served as a crucial buffer state between Russia and British interests in India and Pakistan. However, there is no substantial evidence that the Soviets were the primary catalyst behind the PDPA's rise to power in Afghanistan in 1978. Nonetheless, they did establish close connections with the new Marxist government in Kabul once it seized control of the nation. Consequently, as Islamist groups and other adversaries of the PDPA began uprisings against the new administration throughout 1978 and 1979, the Marxist regime promptly sought assistance from Moscow. Initial support was limited, but as the situation for the PDPA continued to worsen, the Soviet Union essentially invaded Afghanistan in the final days of December 1979. By early 1980, thousands of Soviet tanks and tens of thousands of soldiers had been dispatched as Moscow occupied the primary cities of the country. Even before the Soviet incursion into Afghanistan, bin Laden had swiftly made his way to Pakistan after completing his education at King Abdulaziz University. Pakistan has played, and continues to play, a crucial role in the global jihadist movements of the 20th and early 21st centuries. Officially, the nation has declared its opposition to Islamic fundamentalism existing on its territory, yet for many years it has chosen to ignore this reality, largely because Muslim Pakistan has been engaged in a protracted Cold War with its long-standing adversary, Hindu India, since the British Raj was partitioned along religious lines in 1947. Over the next 3 decades, Pakistan would be significant in bin Laden's life. Once he arrived there in 1979, he quickly fell under the influence of Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian-born jihadist, who inspired many of the leading Islamic jihadists of the late 20th century. Shortly thereafter, Azzam encouraged bin Laden to join the multitude of Muslim men who were traveling to Afghanistan to combat the atheistic Soviet invaders. These individuals became known as Mujahideen, a term that roughly translates as one who engages in holy war or jihad. In the early 1980s, bin Laden began utilizing his inherited wealth to recruit and train Mujahideen in Pakistan before they ventured into Afghanistan's mountainous areas. Although this funding was trivial compared to the billions of dollars expended by the United States and Saudi Arabian governments on equipping and training anti-Soviet forces in both Afghanistan and Pakistan, which served as their proxies to combat the Soviet incursion. Additionally, while claims about the degree to which bin Laden was financed and trained by American agents during this period have been overstated, it is clear that he did have some limited interactions with U.S. special forces in the area in the 1980s. The conflict to which bin Laden attached himself starting in 1980 unfolded much like battles in Afghanistan have over the last 2 centuries. With 80,000 Soviet troops deployed by the close of 1980 and possessing vastly superior weaponry, they were able to seize and maintain control of the primary cities and support the Marxist PDPA. However, the Mujahideen factions, which included both moderate and fundamentalist groups, largely dominated the regions outside the urban centers. The Hindu Kush mountains, which primarily characterize much of the country, especially in the east and north, provide ideal terrain for guerrilla warfare, and this precisely defined the nature of the Soviet-Afghan war throughout the 1980s. The combat became extremely brutal as the Soviets employed indiscriminate bombing and the destruction of rural villages in an attempt to eradicate the insurgents. By the mid-1980s, more than 4 million individuals from Afghanistan's total population of 14 million had been displaced, with hundreds of thousands becoming refugees in Pakistan and Iran, while the conflict resulted in at least 500,000 fatalities and possibly up to 3 times that number. It quickly became recognized as the Soviet equivalent of the Vietnam War for Americans, as the Russians encountered an adversary they could not overcome. During this time, bin Laden emerged as a significant figure in the Mujahideen movement in Afghanistan. Initially, he started supplying resources to the fighters in the nation, and also aided in the movement of individuals from his home country of Saudi Arabia to Pakistan, who wished to take up arms against the Soviets, where they would receive training and equipment before being sent north. Over the years, bin Laden traveled between Pakistan and the Mujahideen strongholds located in the Hindu Kush mountains. In 1984, he and his mentor Abdullah Azzam founded Maktab al-Khidamat, an organization that sought to collect funds from both the Arab and Western worlds to sustain the fight against the Soviets. This financial support was subsequently utilized to buy weaponry and train Mujahideen. By 1986, the network had prepared hundreds of fighters stationed in eastern Afghanistan at bin Laden's base known as Al-Masada, the Lion's Den. These fighters led the Mujahideen efforts against the Soviets and the Marxist regime during the Battle of Jaji in the late spring and early summer of 1987. Although the battle ultimately had little strategic importance in the broader conflict, it earned bin Laden considerable acclaim among the Mujahideen and within the larger Arab world. The creation of Maktab al-Khidamat was crucial in the 1980s as it established the foundation for the jihadist movement with which bin Laden has become associated. As the war in Afghanistan neared an unavoidable defeat for the Soviets and the Marxist regime they supported in the late 1980s, considerations turned to the future of the organization. Some members preferred to maintain it as a moderate entity that continued its efforts against the Soviets, but bin Laden, Abdullah Azzam, and others opposed this notion, believing that Maktab al-Khidamat should evolve into a larger organization that would aim to continue the expulsion of non-Arab powers from the Arab and Muslim world. Ultimately, this more radical faction of the movement led bin Laden and Azzam to create a new organization in 1988 known as Al-Qaeda, which translates to the base or the foundation. Over time, it would grow to become the largest jihadist organization worldwide and is infamously recognized around the globe as such today. Al-Qaeda's objective from the outset was to initiate a holy war or jihad against non-Muslims anywhere in the conventional Muslim world, which includes the Middle East, Lower Central Asia, the Maghreb and North Africa, and also more peripheral areas of the Muslim world, such as Somalia, Mali, and Nigeria, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Muslim territories further east in Indonesia and other locations. Much of its ideological framework focused on eliminating American dominance from the Middle East and also dismantling the State of Israel, which it regarded as a Western stronghold in the Levant. As time passed, the group began to believe it was necessary to provoke a major conflict with the United States to radicalize the Muslim world against the kafir, or non-believers. Since the organization could not realistically engage in direct conflict at the outset, its operating methods during its formative years involved terrorist strategies. Furthermore, Al-Qaeda perceived moderate Muslims as having deviated from authentic Islam, and it aimed to implement a strict version of Islamic governance throughout the Muslim world, one grounded in Sharia law, and a literal reading of the Quran. By the time Al-Qaeda was founded in 1988, the war in Afghanistan was already on the verge of concluding. Upon taking leadership of the Soviet Union in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev publicly declared his aim to end Soviet engagement in the country. However, similar to the prolonged process it took for America to fully withdraw from Vietnam, the Soviets were unable to exit immediately. In fact, in the short term, there was a notable surge in the number of Soviet troops present in Afghanistan, as Moscow sought to swiftly achieve victory through an increase in troop deployment. This effort did not yield success, as Ronald Reagan's administration persisted in sending substantial military and financial support to the Mujahideen. Indeed, once the Mujahideen received Stinger missiles to target Soviet helicopters, the guerrilla war experienced a phase of unprecedented achievement for the insurgents. Ultimately, peace agreements were signed by the Afghan government, the Soviet Union, the US, and Pakistan in 1988 and in 1989. The final Soviet troops were withdrawn. In the years that ensued, the Marxist regime began to lose increasing amounts of territory to the Mujahideen factions, and eventually fell in 1992. Yet, no sooner had the communist regime been removed than the various Mujahideen factions turned against one another. 4 years of civil conflict would ensue before one faction, known as the Taliban, rose to power in 1996, although they would never gain complete dominance over the nation, and much of the North remained under the control of the Northern Alliance into the late 1990s and early 2000s. Following the Soviet-Afghan War, bin Laden initially went back to his home country of Saudi Arabia in 1989. He was celebrated as a hero for his contributions in helping to expel the Russians from Afghanistan. Back in the Arabian Peninsula, he commenced working with the Saudi bin Laden Group, his family's enterprise, in an attempt to utilize its economic strength and business connections to aid the growth of Al-Qaeda. Concurrently, he started engaging with other prominent figures of the Islamic Jihadist movement in Egypt and other regions. During this period, the relationship between bin Laden and the Saudi government began to decline. Bin Laden was determined to pursue an increasingly confrontational approach against non-Muslims, whereas the Saudi government continued to maintain its role as a crucial American ally in the Middle East. A point of contention that emerged between bin Laden and the Saudi regime concerned the South Yemen civil war. Bin Laden desired for Saudi Arabia to intervene directly to remove the Soviet-supported Yemeni Socialist Party, but the royal government in Riyadh obstructed his attempts to do so. Another problem involving a neighboring country of Saudi Arabia was soon to create tension between bin Laden and the Saudi government in ways that would ultimately end relations between him and the Saudi royal family. On the 2nd of August 1990, Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi president who had spent much of the 1980s engaged in a war against Iran, with substantial backing from the United States, invaded the small Gulf state of Kuwait, one of the wealthiest nations to which Iraq owed billions of dollars, borrowed to fund its war against Iran during the 1980s. The invasion, which resulted in the small city-state being conquered within 2 days, sparked international outrage, and within weeks, the United States was assembling a coalition of military partners to initiate a counter-invasion of Iraq, which included Britain, France, Germany, and numerous other nations. It was also endorsed by several Arab and Muslim countries, particularly Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. By the autumn of 1990, as discussions to reach a peaceful resolution were still in progress, American troops began to arrive in the Middle East for a military buildup. They traveled primarily to Saudi Arabia, which was to serve as the staging ground for the liberation of Kuwait, and an attack on Iraq should negotiations fail. That is precisely what transpired, and thus what was referred to as Operation Desert Storm by the U.S. military was launched on the 16th of January 1991. Bin Laden was infuriated from the outset of the military buildup, as the Saudi government consented to a proposal from the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, that America should step in to prevent any expansion of Iraq's aggression into Saudi Arabia. In reaction to this, Bin Laden arranged a meeting with the Saudi ruler, King Fahd, and urged that the country should bar American troops from gathering in Saudi Arabia and that he would deploy his own Arab Legion, created in Afghanistan during the war, to safeguard the Saudi border against any Iraqi invasion. This proposal was rejected, and the U.S. and coalition troop buildup accelerated in the following weeks. As it happened, Bin Laden began openly criticizing the Saudi government, launching a hostile propaganda campaign in which he claimed that the royal family was allowing Western infidels into the kingdom, which was the protector of the holiest sites in Islam, Mecca, and Medina. He also sought to persuade the ulama, the senior Saudi religious scholars, to issue a fatwa or religious declaration condemning the American involvement in the Arabian Peninsula. All of this culminated in a significant rift between Bin Laden and the Saudi government, leading to his expulsion from the country in 1991. Meanwhile, Operation Desert Storm swiftly defeated Iraq and liberated Kuwait in the spring of 1991. Instead of seeking regime change, the U.S. retained Saddam Hussein in power, withdrew its troops from the region, and imposed severe sanctions on Iraq. After being expelled from Saudi Arabia in 1991, Bin Laden moved to Sudan, where he settled in 1992. In 1989, Colonel Omar al-Bashir had taken control in a mostly bloodless military coup. He rapidly instituted a version of Sharia law throughout Sudan, turning the country into a fitting base for Bin Laden to carry on his operations. The Saudi Mujahideen were invited to Sudan personally by Hassan al-Turabi, the Speaker of the Sudanese National Assembly and the second most influential figure in Sudan, next to al-Bashir. Here, Bin Laden quickly established himself in a well-protected compound, with his al-Qaeda followers safeguarding the site with sophisticated weaponry. New training camps for Mujahideen were set up near the capital of Khartoum, and Bin Laden acquired a mansion in the city. Due to the unrestricted freedom he was granted in Sudan, the country was labeled as a state sponsor of international terrorism. As in the aftermath of the Gulf War, Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda had come under increasing scrutiny by the American intelligence agency and the State Department. Thus, while Bin Laden remained in Sudan from 1992 to 1996, the U.S. was tracking his activities almost daily with flyovers of his compound and other intelligence collection efforts. By 1996, U.S. sanctions against Sudan for harboring Bin Laden and several other prominent Islamic fundamentalists and jihadists had started to significantly harm the country's economy. Additionally, President Omar al-Bashir had outmaneuvered Bin Laden's main supporter within the government, Hassan al-Turabi. Consequently, by 1996, it was made evident to Bin Laden that Sudan was no longer a secure haven. Following his expulsion, he returned that year to Afghanistan, where the Taliban had just solidified its control over much of the country. There, he became the personal guest of Mullah Muhammad Omar, the first leader of the Taliban government after taking power. He swiftly declared war against the United States in August 1996 through various Islamic media outlets, contending that the U.S. had occupied Saudi Arabia through its military bases since 1990, and that it was the main backer of Israel in the region. It has been theorized that Bin Laden's actions in 1996 were due to the loss of a significant portion of his wealth from his familial background upon leaving Sudan. and that the order of expulsion further radicalized bin Laden and set him on a course of total war against the United States government, whose sanctions against Sudan had influenced the stance of the Sudanese government. From his return to Afghanistan in 1996 onward, bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were fully dedicated to confrontational jihadist actions, directed specifically at the United States. These actions had consistently been an element of the organization's modus operandi. As early as 1990, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had conducted a raid on the residence of Sayyid no-Sayr, an affiliate of Al-Qaeda in New Jersey, where they uncovered documents related to plans for detonating skyscrapers in New York City. In 1993, a truck bomb exploded outside the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Manhattan. The operation was led by Ramzi Youssef, another known associate of Al-Qaeda, who had received training in one of their camps in Afghanistan during the late 1980s. In 1992, bin Laden financed and coordinated the bombing of the Gold Mihor Hotel in the city of Aden in Yemen. It is also widely believed that Al-Qaeda played a role in the Luxor massacre in November 1997 when 62 individuals, the majority being Western tourists, were murdered in the Egyptian city near the Valley of the Kings by 6 Islamic fundamentalist gunmen. Thus, by the latter half of the 1990s, Al-Qaeda was escalating its assaults on Western targets using terrorist tactics. These assaults would soon intensify even more. On the 7th of August 1998, simultaneous truck bombings took place in the cities of Dar es Salaam, the capital of Tanzania, and the capital of Kenya, Nairobi. There was no question about which country was the symbolic target of these assaults, as the bombs detonated outside the United States embassies in both capital cities. There is also no doubt that bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were accountable, and in the immediate aftermath of the bombings, bin Laden was included on the FBI's list of 10 most wanted individuals. It also drew the attention of all intelligence agencies in the Western world to Al-Qaeda, although regrettably, the threat that the terrorist organization posed was still not fully understood. This concludes the first part of the documentary. If you enjoyed it, stay tuned for the second part. I hope you found this video helpful and inspiring. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know what topics you'd like to see next. Thank you for watching.